A few years ago, I had a computer simulation I wanted to do for a computer game, and I knew the simulation was going to take a very long time. I was thinking years. And so I did a back of the envelope estimation of how long the program would take to run. I ran what I thought was about a billionth of the program. It's a little bit technical how I estimated it to be a billionth. But the simulation took 1,000 seconds, about 15 minutes. And so I estimated the entire simulation would take, well, 1,000 times a billion is 1,000,000,000,000 seconds. And I thought, hey, that's not too bad. I was thinking that it might be a few generations, right? I could start the computer program and I would pass the computer down to my children. Maybe my grandchildren would see the result. I mean, my grandparents left some things for me, right? And so I was thinking maybe I'll leave my grandchildren a computer because, well, our generation is different than my grandparents, right? My grandparents left me some jewelry. I'll leave a computer instead, right? And so I did a calculation of how long 1,000,000,000,000 seconds was. And to my dismay, I discovered that would take us to the next ice age. It was about 32,000 years. And then I started to imagine, I was working on my PhD at the time, and I had a very nice office. I often stayed overnight at the office. And I imagined the computer still in that office, and the office and the entire campus being buried under miles of snow, and the computer still chugging away at the problem. And the computer was kind of keeping the room heated, right, because it was covered under mountains of ice, right? And so I discovered that 1,000,000,000,000 seconds, even though seconds go very fast, right? You could blink your eye and miss a good fraction of a second. You could catch COVID-19 in like a second, right? So it's very fast, right? But 1,000,000,000,000 of them is just insurmountable, right? Okay, I like to drink this what is this? Pure Leaf black tea. Especially when I'm doing intermittent fasting, caffeine really helps, right? I'm hoping to break the caffeine habit as well, even when I'm fasting. But that's 2 liters right there, and it made me think about what 1,000,000,000,000 would look like. Is that something you could drink in your lifetime, maybe 1,000,000,000,000? Well, and then I looked at other bodies of water around me, right? The Puget Sound. I live not far from the Puget Sound. And I discovered the Puget Sound is only 168 billion liters, right? 1,000,000,000,000 is 7 of those Puget Sounds, right? And then I love to program computer games. I do a lot of card and dice games. And I started to think if I could have a card game that was about 1,000,000,000, that used about 1,000,000,000,000 cards, right? And what kind of game you could play with that. That's a huge game, right? There aren't even 1,000,000,000 poker hands, right? And I was wondering if at least the computer could handle trillions of cards, right? It depends on how complex the game is, right? I have about 8 gigabytes of, on my other computer I have 64 gigabytes of RAM. Right now it's running a simulation, so the one I'm using for my YouTube videos even that one has 8 gigabytes of RAM. Now my hard disk has about 1,000,000,000,000 bytes of a terabyte of space, right? So you can think of it as the computer can kind of remember 8 billion numbers and recall them fast, right? That's kind of like the short-term memory of the computer. But it could also remember 1,000,000,000 numbers, but very slowly, right? It has to go to the disk, right? That's kind of like the long-term memory, right? If I asked you to think about something that happened 10 minutes ago, right, that would be like your RAM. If I asked you something that happened 5 years ago, you might have to go to your disk, right? So that's how I like to think about it. And so I imagine what 1,000,000,000 cards would look like and if you were to stack them up. Now, 52 cards is about a centimeter high, right? So 1,000,000,000 cards, that's about 2,000 kilometers high, right? That's about 10 times as high as the International Space Station flies, right? About 100 times what you would fly in a commercial airplane, right? Okay, and then I like dice games as well, and I started to think about what it would be like if I had 1,000,000,000 dice, right? Probably not made of silver, because that's more silver than there exists. Ever mind, right? Okay, so one die, this one's made of 99.9% silver, is about a centimeter on each side, right? So a trillion dice would be 10,000 dice in one direction, 10,000 in another, and then 10,000 high, right? So about 10 kilometers in each direction, right? So think about a block of silver covering most of downtown Seattle and maybe a little bit of the east side and Lake Washington, and then extending about as high as you would fly in a plane, right? Think about a big cube of silver. Like, that's more silver than ever mined in history, right? But that would be a trillion silver dice, right? Now think about a world population of a trillion, right? So today, roughly half of the world population lives in cities, and there are about 10,000 cities in the world, right? So imagine half of that trillion, so 500 billion people now living in 10,000 cities, and you would have about 50 million people per city around the world, right? Think about that. New York has a population of about 10 million. Tokyo is also about 10 million. So imagine your New Yorks and your Tokyos being 5 times more populated than they already are, but there are other cities that are much smaller, right? Imagine a city like Ellensburg, Washington, or like, think about your upstate New York, right? Rochester or Albany. Imagine all of those becoming 5 times more populated than New York is today, right? And then you got the rural areas that are now much more populated as well, right? Imagine that, well, half of the world population right now lives in the country, right? So that's about 5 billion, but imagine that becoming 500 billion, right? Imagine you took rural Montana and you multiplied the population by 100. That would still make something that resembles a city by today's standard, right? So imagine the whole world being cities, and then mega cities that had 50 million plus people, right? Good luck trying to do any sort of social distancing in any place like that, right? Anyways, so I hope I've given you some food for thought on what a trillion is. Hopefully next time you hear about trillions of debt or deficits, that will hit the concept home. Right? Oh, the other way I like to think about big numbers like this, right, especially if they relate to politics, is to think how much per head, right? So the U.S. population is about 330 million. So every trillion, that's about 3,000 per capita right there, right? So when the politicians say, I'm going to spend 3 trillion, in my head, I think I'm going to spend 10,000 per person, right? And think if I still like that policy or not, right?